There's a large amount of gaslighting that goes on in discussions on antinatalism, and it goes something like this. Coming into existence can't be so bad because you're still here. The fact that you haven't ended your existence shows that you don't regret being born. So this is an attempt by natalists to gaslight antinatalists into thinking that they actually don't oppose procreation and they don't regret their own coming into existence because they're still here. If they regretted it so much, surely they would have ended their own existence by now. So in this video, I want to clear this up and go over why I don't think that an antinatalist continuing their existence implicitly endorses their own coming into existence. And how I'm going to do this is I've split it into a few different sections. So the first one I want to go into is differentiating between a life worth continuing and a life worth starting. So first off, continuing a life that already exists is not the same as starting one that does not exist. And there's this ambiguous phrase of a life worth living that kind of confuses these two things. So an antinatalist could actually say that their life is worth living, but mean that the life they have now is worth continuing, not that it was worth starting in the first place. And I think that the reason antinatalists can think their life is worth continuing, even though it wasn't worth starting, is because of the interests and desires that are present in each case. So let's break this down. So if you have someone who already exists, they have an interest in continuing to exist. That's assuming obviously that their life is sufficiently good. Obviously there are some cases where people do not think their life is worth continuing and their life is degraded to such a sufficient degree that actually it would be better if they ended their existence. But we're not talking about those cases. We're talking about the average case of a person who exists and has an interest in continuing to exist, and therefore continuing to exist serves that interest. The difference between this and a potential future person that doesn't exist yet is that that potential future person literally doesn't exist to have the desire or interest to have the life that they would have if they were created. So let's just recap that. A life can be worth continuing because there's already someone in existence to want to continue existing, but you can't say the same of starting a life because the person you would be creating does not exist to have the interest or desire in that life starting. But also antinatalists recognize that life contains a significant amount of suffering and the guarantee of death as well. So when you create someone, not only do they not exist to have the interest in coming into existence, but you've also imposed that suffering and those ills on them as well. And then bringing it back to the person who exists already, they obviously already exist, so they're already going to face death. Like, you're not imposing a new death on someone. And they're also in existence to be able to choose whether they want to or how they want to navigate the future suffering in their life. So I think for these two reasons, antinatalists can be perfectly consistent in thinking that a life is worth continuing but not worth starting, including their own. So to give a brief analogy to illustrate this, imagine someone is wrongfully imprisoned. Now, we're all going to agree that it's not okay to wrongfully imprison people, but we can also agree that if the conditions are sufficient, that person who was wrongfully imprisoned may actually do better staying in prison, despite the fact that it would have been best if they weren't wrongfully imprisoned in the first place. So this could be the case when someone has spent a sufficient amount of time in prison and they know more about life in prison than they do outside of prison. They've based their meaning, their community, everything they know is inside the confines of this prison, such that life inside the prison is actually better than life outside the prison would be. And this is a real phenomenon. It's called being institutionalized. Maybe the most famous depiction of this is in The Shawshank Redemption, where multiple characters become institutionalized, and it's clearly better for them to remain living in prison than to be let out of prison to live in the outside world. So just like it can make sense for antinatalists to want to continue existing even if they regret coming into existence in the first place, it can make complete sense for someone to want to remain living inside prison even though they can recognize that it would have been better if they weren't wrongfully imprisoned in the first place. So another reason why I think antinatalists are completely consistent in wanting to continue existing even though they regret coming into existence is because once we're in existence, we're stuck in a variety of catch-22s. So a catch-22 in simple terms is basically just this paradoxical situation where the solution to a problem is actually also the problem. So a classic example is when someone's applying for their first job and all of the job descriptions say that you need prior experience. How is this person supposed to get a job? Because they need experience to get the job, but they need a job to be able to get experience as well. Here, this is a classic example of being stuck in a catch-22. And likewise, antinatalists view life as containing a variety of catch-22s. So the first catch-22 is the fact that once we're created in this body that is capable of immense suffering that is not even comprehensible to the average person. And many people fall foul of this in that they have awful lives that contain a lot of suffering. But even though it would be, if they rationally assessed it, in their best interests to end their existence, they actually continue because of the fear of death, or they expect their death to be gruesome in some way. We have this evolutionarily built-in fear of death, and that fear of death is strong enough to cause people to stick around and suffer whilst they're alive. Another catch-22 is that most people have obligations and responsibilities to others, whether that be a child or a partner or family member, friend, a companion animal, or anyone else. Sticking around to fulfill those obligations and responsibilities can cause the person a lot of suffering. But what can also cause them a lot of suffering is the thought of exiting existence and leaving behind those that are dependent on them. And the third catch-22, and the final one that I'll talk about, but I'm sure there's a range of other ones, is that someone may be sticking around because they know that exiting existence themselves may cause suffering to others. And so again, someone may stick around and endure living a life that's not worth continuing simply because they don't want to cause others suffering, like grief. So these are 3 examples of catch-22s that once we exist, we're caught in a complex web of, that I think simply add an extra case as to why you should not be creating someone. And also another reason why I think an antinatalist continuing to exist is not an implicit endorsement of having come into existence. And I think the people trying to gaslight antinatalists and saying that them continuing to exist does implicitly endorse their coming into existence really lack appreciation and empathy for the catch-22s that, let's be honest, most people find themselves in. Now, the third thing I want to talk about, I actually want to do a separate video on, so I won't go in too much detail here, but I think another reason that people can continue to exist even though it doesn't endorse their coming into existence is that there's some dynamic going on that I think can be somewhat accurately referred to as Stockholm syndrome. So Stockholm syndrome is a psychological condition where a victim empathizes with and identifies with their captor or abuser and their goals. And I think this can happen in the context of existence in 2 ways, but there may be more. So I think, like in an abusive relationship, when someone can become attached to and actively maintain the relationship that they are in with their abuser for a variety of reasons, so can a person, and I think people do, have the same sort of dynamic with life. We become attached to life when we are actually in a dynamic with it, which I think could accurately be analysed as an abusive relationship. So we're set up in a situation where we have a body that makes these constant demands of us to chase pleasure and desire and satisfaction, plus the additional threat of suffering if we don't fulfill this range of desires and needs. Evolution has built into us what Aldous Huxley referred to in Brave New World as people falling in love with their oppression.
Now, I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, as I foresaw in Brave New World, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in situations where they oughtn't to be happy.
Life is simply a series of needs and demands made of us by our body and the outside world that we have to fulfill at the threat of suffering. And evolution has crafted us in such a way that we have fallen in love with this. And the second way I think that a Stockholm Syndrome-esque dynamic could be set up is when it comes to the retrospective consent that people talk about their offspring giving. So often what people will do is give retrospective consent to having come into existence. So they'll say, my life is great, I don't regret being born. But I don't think these people are a reliable source. If you think about it, this is consent coming from someone who has been under the emotional influence influence of the people who created them for perhaps multiple decades. And during this time, clearly the offspring has become extremely emotionally attached to these people in such a way that their rational faculties will have clearly become compromised when thinking about the specific action of coming into existence from an ethical dimension. One obviously example of a warped ethical judgment when it comes to this parent-child relationship is that offspring will usually value their creators much higher than a stranger, even to the order of maybe sacrificing 5, 6 or more strangers for the sake of one individual who happens to be their creator. The emotional ties that have been formed by parents with their child, with no malice intent, I'll add, will produce a person whose retrospective consent, I would say, cannot be trusted, or should at the very least be highly suspect. Now, I'm not saying that just because this dynamic can be accurately described as Stockholm syndrome, that people therefore shouldn't be continuing to exist. I think they should if they want to. I just think that it's important to highlight the ethical dynamics that are going on here. So the final bit I want to get onto is the fact that antinatalists can want to continue to exist because of the good they can do in the world. Antinatalists can do a lot of good for both humans and animals, and I think this is an additional reason why antinatalists would want to continue existing. So anyway, I hope this sheds some light on to why I think it's completely coherent for antinatalists to want to continue existing, whilst that not being an implicit endorsement of their coming into existence. And I really think natalists need to stop this immature gaslighting of antinatalists, trying to make them doubt that they have any ethical problem with bringing new sentient beings into existence, and they just need to try and focus on addressing the arguments instead. Anyway, has anyone ever tried to gaslight you with this? What did you think of my response to it? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.